Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Please welcome today's guest, Patrick Esposito, author of the book, The Structure of Success, a framework to help build your business better. Patrick, welcome, and especially because you are a fellow mountaineer, as I am, who went to the West Virginia University. It's so thrilling to have my second mountaineer, John Chambers, who built Cisco Systems, was on 4 years ago on my show, and it was great to have him as well. So welcome.
Well, one, thanks for having me, and two, John Chambers, obviously a great business leader, a great mountaineer, right? Like you, a
Yeah,
great mountaineer. Love the blue and gold on your logo background, by the way. So,
I, who cannot go with the blue and gold? That's we live for that. So let's start off with you telling us about your professional background and how you got to where you're at now, before we dive into the book.
right. So, honestly, Mark, I almost would characterize myself as an accidental entrepreneur, right? So, growing up in, West Virginia in the heart of Appalachia, I saw a lot of things that I thought needed to change, right? We just needed to, frankly, have a better economy, more opportunities, and growing up, right, I thought the way to do that was through public service. So, in undergrad, I focused on social sciences. In graduate school, I ended up with an opportunity to go overseas, again, focused on social sciences. Ended up doing a law degree, and a vision, right, that I had was to go back and engage in public service, and try to help the state that I grew up in and a state that I cared deeply about. Along that way, though, as I was, working during law school to earn a little bit of extra income, had an opportunity to explore a bunch of different opportunities, right? Obviously, you could guess, worked at a law firm, worked at a political magazine, worked probably without me really knowing it at the time, worked at a management consultancy. And through that, was sort of in Washington, D.C. during, the late 90s as they had some of their tech boom and tech bust, right, that went on in the software world. The management consulting that I did focused on the, software space. And my then girlfriend, now wife, was deeply engaged in a couple of startups in the DC area. So I got to kind of learn about that in an informal way, right? And so um, when I went back to West Virginia working for a uh, former congressman who became governor, who I'd done some work for with his campaigns, I realized that I fundamentally lacked the temperament for public service, right? When you are an impatient person and generally love new ideas and creative outcomes, sometimes inside of government is not the place to be. So I realized that if I was truly going to have impact in the region I cared about, what I probably needed to do was take my natural proclivities and ended up starting a business. The first business was actually with my father, with my then girlfriend, now wife. One of our first hires was one of my best friends in the world. So, made all those mistakes they tell you not to do, right? Don't start a business up with family. Don't start a business up with your spouse. Don't hire your friends. Made all those mistakes, and it actually worked out great, right? We managed to build a terrific team. It was, initially a consulting business that wanted to become a product business. And we ended up finding a good product niche after making a couple of pivots and a few minor tweaks, raised some venture money, grew it so that it was, on a great trajectory ended up on the Inc. 500 and ultimately acquired by a multinational leader in our space that was called Hexagon through their subsidiary that they had acquired not too long before they acquired us, called Intergraph. Ended up with basically a similar opportunity in a different space. It was a physical products company, non-pneumatic or airless tires, a startup that I got into with some business associates, and we ended up with that startup, Resilient Technologies, getting acquired by another global market leader. In this case, it was Polaris, right? The folks who make ATVs and snowmobiles. So went through that journey, tried to figure out, am I a startup person? Am I not a startup person, right? And so was fortunate enough to be able to be invited into a publicly traded company as a jack of all trades and master of none, right? Probably nothing better when you're an entrepreneur if you want to go into a larger organization than to have that type of role. My title was technically Chief Legal and Risk Officer, but I was involved in a lot of other areas of the business, right? Everything from uh, corporate strategy support to project management, and obviously the risk compliance and legal areas, and realize, gosh, I really, really love smaller organizations, right? Really valued the medium-sized business opportunity in a publicly traded company. But one of the things I really love is helping other leaders of small businesses to achieve great things, whatever their path is that they want to be on, or whatever the path is that they should be on. And sometimes those two things don't align. You got to figure out how to make them align. And so ended up working both in some areas that focus on getting technology startups to do a better job injecting their technologies into the US federal government and the public sector space more broadly, as well as what I've done now with the book, The Structure of Success, where, ideally, right, I think it's a great general purpose guide for folks who are trying to figure out how to make their business even stronger.
And that was my next question is why did you write this book? And I think especially every entrepreneur feels like they have a book in them. I've written 6 books, so I thought I had a lot of books in me.
Right.
So what made you write this book?
So Mark, you are leaps and bounds ahead of me, right? I think I may have one book in me. It was this one. I think I may be done as an author, right? I don't think I could ever achieve the 6 that you have, because it does take, right, a tremendous amount of time and energy uh,
Discipline.
to make that happen. So that's pretty amazing on the 6. I'll tell you, I decided to write the book for 2 reasons. One, to your point, every entrepreneur thinks they have lessons that it would be great for others to be able to gain the benefit of. Are we right about that? Who knows, right? We'll see, depending upon how valuable people believe the books to have been. What I saw though, as I started moving out of running, right, technology companies and, supporting and moving into supporting roles, right, where I was either, advising or in a larger organization, like I mentioned. And what I saw was a lot of the businesses, right, that I was getting brought into to help them, either as a board member or as like, a strategic advisor, they were making a lot of the same mistakes, right? And when I say that, I mean, sometimes you bring in advisors to help with growth, right? And sometimes you bring in advisors when you feel like something's off and you want some other type of input, right? Whether it's a sounding board or another voice to help support decision making. And so I saw that there were a lot of the same elements that were causing businesses to either have problems, right? Genuine problems confronting them, or where they felt like they were missing opportunities, right? Things were still growing, right? Or things were still operating, but they felt like something was missing as far as their ability to truly make that business great. So I started thinking about what are we seeing here, right? So I had some theories, around what are basically the key foundational elements, right, that you need to have businesses consider if they want to be successful over time. And when, we had a significant event, right, in all of our worlds, right, the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all had to begin working differently and thinking differently about how to operate our businesses and how to engage clients and how to work with our team members. I decided, you know what, maybe it's time to see if my theories um, might be validated by other business leaders. So I um, ended up structuring a survey of other business leaders, surveyed 100, um, folks who would be regarded as, I think, well regarded as experts in the small to medium sized business space, right? And looked at what they thought, right, had impacted their businesses either positively or negatively, and what were the structural components of their business that impacted those successes and failures. And as it turns out, that aligned exceptionally well to the theory I had, right, around these 8 factors that help to really drive success or failure, right, of small and medium-sized business enterprises.
Well, and that's what this book is very practical, good for college students who want to be in business. To get, I love, I like it when operators run things because, as an operator,
Yep,
we tend to see things for what they are and the reality of them.
that's
Where, when you're at universities and professors have never done it and it's all theoretical, it really it doesn't. So, which requires a longer conversation. So,
right.
in chapter one, the
Right.
chapter highlights the importance of embracing change.
Yep.
In practice, how do you balance the need for change with the importance of maintaining core values and a consistent brand identity, especially in established businesses?
So, I think there's two phrases that you brought into that question, right? Which I think actually I'm going to use them to kind of anchor the response, right? So the core values, I think that's important, right? Critically important when you're looking at change. What is our business mission? What do we believe in, both externally for our customers, clients, and internally for our employees, our co-owners, and if we have them, our investors. Those core values, right? If you're able to consider them as you look at change, right? And think about not making changes that violate those core values that you want to hold true, that's obviously critically important. Now, as far as the consistent brand identity, this is the part where I would say that's part of change, right? And I think sometimes you have businesses that believe they are one thing when the reality is the market dynamics are changing, right? And so what they will become because of the way the market dynamics are changing, that brand identity may not be what they defined it to be, right? And so, when we go and we look at larger organizations, right? And I think there's a lot of folks who talk about how fascinating it is that now when we think of cameras, right, we think of these things, right? And it's interesting that historically, right, at one time you would have thought of Kodak or other,
Time,
yeah,
every day.
right, every day. And so when you look at that, you can say, okay, what is our brand identity? I believe Kodak thought they were a camera maker. What they really were a documenter of memories, right? And you think about that evolution of the brand identity that could have perhaps been very helpful to Kodak as, the larger cameras, right, and film moved into digital and ultimately into phones being our cameras. You know, Sometimes I look at the brand identity as almost being a trap, right? A trap for change that needs to take place as the market and evolutions of time and products potentially signal to us that the brand identity we thought we had, we may need to consider that either what we thought we had needs to be changed or that we may need to evolve completely to something different.
Yeah, I think Kodak is a good example of not making that change when you really needed to make the change and saying to themselves, clearly what happened with Kodak is there was so much fat margin in film that I
Mhm.
could see from teaching at Wharton that a bunch of finance guys basically looked and said, "Hey, we get 99% net margins on
Yep,
this business. We'll ride this baby until we can't ride it anymore," thinking, who cares if Kodak survives or not? Well,
that's
then
right.
we'll make the leap to digital when we absolutely have to, and the bridge is totally almost burnt down.
That's
And
absolutely right.
and that's a mistake. I just had one of my students do a report to pick a company and do a report on them. And it's interesting. They picked Blockbuster, and they told me something I had not known
Yep.
before, and that
Perfect
was
example.
Blockbuster was making $900 million a year in late fees. Well, that would never happen in, in Netflix, and they had the chance to buy Netflix for $50 million and turned it down because they were an $8 billion company. If you're making 10, nine,
On the
almost
late
a
fees.
billion
Yeah.
dollars in
Yeah.
late fees, I said, oh, that explains why these guys didn't want to do it. And they had their franchise system,
Right.
right? So they weren't wanting to do that, and they didn't think to themselves, well, could we make the franchisees warehouses to go and distribute
Right.
these videos? None of that went into play.
Right.
And
Right.
so hence Blockbuster disappeared, a global name that everybody knew.
Right. Right.
And Netflix just kept evolving. Now, how much did those guys wish they could have bought that business for 50 million?
Right. That's exactly right. Well, and to your point, right? It's what was Blockbuster providing, right? They were really a provider of entertainment within your home, right? And unfortunately, they thought they were a provider of, VS, Betamax, VHS, and DVDs, right? And they misunderstood what their value proposition was, and somebody else understood where the market was trending far better than they did, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all you can see is that these guys were short-term thinkers and look at the margins they were making in that business, especially, as I said, the late fees, and
Yeah.
saying, let's ride this horse until it dies, when it
Right.
was
Right.
unnecessary to do it that way.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, so in chapter one, there's a constructive worry is presented as a key element of success. Could you provide examples of how this approach differs in practice for a startup versus a more mature organization, particularly in industries with varying levels of risk? And I think you need to describe constructive worry.
Yeah. So, some people by nature, right, are warriors, right? Some people are not. And those who are not, I truly applaud because unfortunately I am in the warrior camp, right? And, if you've led a business, especially through either uncertain or turbulent times, I would be surprised if anybody said there weren't periods as a business leader where they didn't sleep well, right? And again, that's because, you do have these concerns and stress points around what the future looks like, and in some cases, even what the end of the week on payroll looks like, right? And so, what I tend to tell folks is, you can absorb a lot of energy in a very negative way with just worrying. But if you think about, you know, both what are you worrying about and what is causing that worry, and get sort of in front of it and say, how can I create changes to allow me, really to sleep better, right? At
Yeah.
night, you'll end up with far better outcomes. And so, I joke that my my late paternal grandmother was a very much a worrier, right? So, if there was something that you could worry about, by golly, she found it. And in a lot of ways that can be negative. But if you can channel that thought process, that energy, that vision for the bad things that can happen, you can often end up with them not happening, right? And end up with some very good outcomes because of that worry being channeled. And so, you know, a, a couple of ways that I like to sort of provide some examples of that. One of the businesses, right, that I started, Augusta Systems, right, the first startup I had, and again, one of the ones I'm most proud of, right, because you learn a lot through that first journey. We started as a consultancy looking for a product, ended up with a product that was environmental management suite, that, had there been global adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, would have had a great business. When you think about environmental commodity management, that sounds like something that is right here today. And unfortunately, we started that business at the end of 2001. So we were very early, right? And so one of the things I started worrying about was, you've got this amazing technology that you're building out. The market that we thought was going to be there is not there, right? Our consulting work is still growing. So how do you find a pathway out of this expenditure you've made on building software for a market that wasn't going to be there in the near term? And again, if we'd waited 20 years and probably rewrote the code base several times over, we might have had something, but you just can't do that, right? So what we found was, we really needed to find a new market opportunity, right? And so obviously the worry part was, have we made a really bad investment, right? The worry part was, have we hired team members who have specific expertise in this area that may not be a fit for where we go? And what we found was, environmental management, a lot of real-time data. What the world really needed was um, real-time data from sensors and other devices and real-time control of those devices. And had I been a wiser soul, I would have said we had an Internet of Things platform that we've started building. I wasn't quite that savvy, so I thought it was intelligent sensor middleware. But what our goal, right, was to basically, same things that people talk about with the Internet of Things, bring all of these devices into the enterprise and make sure that the data that folks who are in the enterprise need to both, do analysis, make decisions, and take actions, totally available to them with as much field level intelligence as we could get. Now, how did we end up with that product vision? It was because we had to do a lot of worrying along the way, right? We had to worry about markets, we had to worry about opportunities. And as we went through that journey, and we built a great platform that was used, and actually continues to be used by the acquirer, even beyond 10 years after the acquisition. Obviously, they've made some improvements along the way. But what we found was we made this great decision to make this great product, but then you started seeing large organizations talking about the same things that we were doing. Actually, Cisco, right? Great partner, started talking about Internet of Things and how they were going to bring that to people. Microsoft, again, a great partner, started talking about that. So you start to say, okay, if the large organizations that we're partnering with have to be powered by a small enterprise, how much time are they going to work with the small enterprise? Or to your point with Blockbuster and Netflix, you've either got to grow a lot, right? Or you have to end up in those larger organizations. So, I tend to look at constructive worry as something that has value at every step, whether it's, when you're looking at opportunities to make change inside the business to help the business grow or survive, and when you're looking at what does the exit look like, right? Because if you're not worried about what could possibly negatively impact you, you're not going to be able to make the right decisions to have positive outcomes.
I think that's like a Secret Service view of how you're protecting the president, right? You're thinking
Right.
of every kind of conceivable way something could go wrong, and how do you go and thwart that in order to be successful?
Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. And to your point, also being able to think about multiple plans, right? And multiple strategies. And, sometimes I tell folks that, I know you want to build a software company, but when I look at your software, until you get another year of product development in there, you have a software and support services company because nobody's going to be able to use the software you've built as well as you can use it to create outcomes. So look, you're best off, right? Packaging not just your software, you get that product revenue you want, but you're going to have to package some services with that to do some configuration, or else I don't think you're going to end up with buyers, right? So to your point, you've got to worry about plans. You've got to worry about multiple scenarios and also listening, right, to your customers, listening to your team members about what they're hearing about the changes that need to happen in your business.
Yeah, and things are such rapidly changing that that's for every single person's business, no matter what you are, because you're competing on a global basis.
That's
It's getting
exactly right.
harder, getting harder and harder. In chapter two, human-centered design thinking is
Right.
presented as a core approach. Could
Right.
you elaborate on how this approach can be effectively applied to foundational business elements like governance and succession planning, which may not have direct users in the traditional product development sense?
Yep, absolutely. So, you know, when we, I guess when we as business leaders think about the, the data that we need to make better business decisions, right? One of the things I think that we often fail to do is ask questions, right? If we were strong enough to think about how to start a business and get it off the ground, or have been strong enough operating a business, we often think that maybe sometimes we know best, right? And that's very dangerous, right? You can end up with some of the very best opportunities for making positive change, right? From asking the right questions and listening to your customers, listening to your team members. And to your point, it's not just about products, right? And it's not just about services. Looking at any organization, one of the things that I like to often ask people is, what is the voice we're missing, right? And what is the voice we're missing in our management team? What is the voice we're missing in our governance team? And it sort of forces you to think a little bit outside of yourself, right? We tend to have this unfortunate characteristic that either, we tend to look for people who think like us or have common backgrounds because there's some comfort in that, right? Or we go 100% the other way and we say, I want everybody to have a fundamentally different voice than I had, and really, bringing those two things together with some common voices and some voices that do not have those same common backgrounds and experiences. That's where we end up with great value, right? Because that gives us the ability to have a meaningful discourse with disparate viewpoints, but not just sparring, right? Where every viewpoint is divergent. So when we're looking at sort of governance and succession planning and the user input piece, right? Talking to however your governance process is set up, whether it's just co-owners, right? Having a frank conversation around what are we not getting from the dialogues with ourselves? What are we missing? Those are really important. I'll give you an example of that in a second. When it's, about succession planning, and this is something that I think a lot of folks say, I wish I had thought about this before, right? They have, maybe two owners of a business. Those two owners, one is sort of external, right? That is the person who's driving sales. One is sort of let's call it the production side, right? Whether it's technology or whether it's services, they're the one responsible for sort of getting the job done. And when one of those two people either has a health problem or decides to potentially move on from the business, you have a lot of risk with that business, right? And so when you're looking at the user experience with succession planning, I often say that whether it's the management team, the ownership team, they really need to look inside and say, what do I feel like is the most significant value I am obtaining from my partners, whether it's owners or management team members, in moving this business forward, and what would I be concerned about losing, right? That's the way to me to sort of get that input of what do I need at that sort of management team succession planning level. And as far as governance goes, I'll tell you, I had two founders, co-owners of a business, and they came to me and said, "Hey, I'm not sure if you ever do things like this, but we'd be interested in having you participate in our board meetings." And I said, "Sure, I'm keen to be on your board." And they said, "No, no, we don't want you on our board. We want you in our board meetings." And I said, "Okay, tell me what you're thinking, right?" And so they said, "Look, we still want the two of us to control every decision, but there's times where we're not sure when we have a disagreement how to, you know, maybe work past that and how to have a third voice to either say, well, this is right, or, you should compromise." But the other thing that we want is somebody who's just going to bring different ideas, because we're concerned we have blinders on, and that our perspective of what the future of our business should look like, we may be not thinking about things. And if we just have a fresh perspective in those meetings to push us a little bit to even think about things we're not thinking about, we think that would be great. And so what I kind of chuckle about is, as we went down that path, one of the things we started finding was, they were both extremely talented business leaders, and what they really needed was just that third voice in the room to help them with those conversations. And oftentimes we ended up pointing back to, well, why don't you ask the management team, right? Why don't you ask these customers? Because at the end of the day, you can have conversations with your governance team that actually point you back to inputs the governance team needs are with other users whether they are employees or customers.
I'm amazed that they didn't feel like they could go to their board and they wanted you as a consultant, but they could have gotten you as a board member and giving them the same advice that you're doing. And it made you think to yourself, wait a minute, maybe their board isn't very good, or they're not utilizing the board in a correct way. And here they're going to go and spend maybe money unnecessarily and bringing you in when they could have had you for a more robust role.
Well, to your point, it's actually funny. So their board was a board of two. It was just them, right? And they didn't want anybody else there. And I sort of was in their board meetings as essentially as a non-voting board member, right? To your point, you're not a real board member, you don't have a vote. But it was actually fascinating because truly out of that, I started thinking more as I was looking at the concepts in this book around what does governance mean, right? Because so many of us think about governance as being something that's only really for large organizations, right? You think about, to your point, formal board meetings with board books and, a monthly or quarterly cadence with a, standard agenda. And you think, to your point, of paying folks to be board members. What I found from this experience, though, was that governance actually can take on a different meaning at different scales of a business and in different ways. And so, you know, looking at the continuum of governance as I, have tended to look at it now, you've got your formal board of directors, then you have your boards of advisors, then you have these informal, right? Whether it's informal advisors as a group, whether it's uh, a group of family and friends, or, they all tend to help you with the governance issues. And I think a lot of folks, especially when you're dealing with a small business, tend to shy away from that term governance, because it to them seems, almost too grand, too costly, right, to consider. And so, to me, your governance, however you look at it, formal board of directors or just one informal third voice in a group of meetings, right? That should really be your security council for your business, right? And help protect the value that you've built and help you to create new value.
That's what the purpose of having this people with you.
Exactly.
The framework emphasizes rebuilding foundational elements. What process do you recommend for businesses to identify and prioritize which foundational elements require the most immediate attention, especially when resources are limited?
Right. Well, to your point, right, earlier around that human-centered design thinking, right? The way that I usually look at this is either, take one team to start or both teams thinking independently, right? Your governance team, your management team, for a lot of businesses, those are exactly the same people anyway, right? And ask them, right, about what are the biggest problems we have as a business? What are the most significant opportunities we have? And if it's problems or opportunities, how do we solve those? And normally, right, you'll find those critical pain points pretty quickly. And frankly, it comes down to that asking the people who know your business better than anybody else where the pain points are, and concerns are, and opportunities. When you ask those questions of the team, you end up um, finding the things you need to address. And normally, right, it's the things that you see multiple times. And you see it not just multiple times, but with more energy around um, the concern or the potential way to address. And, Mark, one of the other things that we see is, while I have this concept right in the book that has been validated by the survey research I've done, of these 8 areas, right? Governance, management team, um, whether you need to make adjustments or pivots to the business, the internal growth and infrastructure to sustain the business, and then, the structure around how you might manage business disputes or breakups, how you look at M&A and mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships, and then looking at the things that we often don't like to talk about, right? Being prepared for disasters and doing succession planning. Most of the things that we find that need to be addressed in a business usually fit in one of those eight buckets, right? And as the business grows, as the management team ages, what's important may change. As the external factors in markets change, what we need to do may change. But asking the questions and asking them on some regularized basis with the ability to have also constant conversation when something new pops up, I think is the way you make sure your business stays strong.
In chapter 3 identifies those eight critical and strategic decision categories you're talking about.
Right.
In practice, how should business leaders prioritize these categories, especially when operating in resource constrained environments or during different stages of business growth, from startup to mature? And I think they always prioritize sales over anything, but that may
Right.
not be the smart move.
Right. So, someone once said we can revenue our way out of any problem. And I'm not sure that's true, but I think a lot of folks believe it to be. And look, at the end of the day, sales do solve a lot of problems. It gives you often the resources to be able to solve the other problems, right? So looking at the resource constrained environment, because most businesses are resource constrained in some way, right? Whether it's because you have certain margins you want to hit, or whether it's just because you have cash flow issues. Most businesses have some resource constraints. The One of the things that I tend to tell businesses, don't try to do too many things at once, right? So when you're looking at the importance, right, of the changes, the importance is going to come, like I said, from the volume and also the energy around those potential things we need to change. And it's also going to come because as a management team, right? And or as a governance team or both, part of what you are focused on is looking at what do we need to do and how do we need to improve. And so when you look at those inputs of problems, opportunities, and solutions, you can generally, right, have a sense of what would help the business the most. And the smaller the business, the less things you ought to focus on. And I usually tell people start with one, right? Solve one problem that you can in the near term. And then if you have other problems or opportunities you need to seize, do that next, right? Make it sequential. Don't take too many change initiatives on at once because then you actually won't accomplish anything, right? It's pretty easy to say if we do one thing and do it well, then we can do something else and do that well. But if we're never focused on actually, implementation of one thing, chances are if we start three things, we're not going to finish them.
Yeah, because you don't even have the resources or time. So it reminds me of my students that take 10 classes in a semester. You learn nothing, and you
That's
can't
right.
get any of them done right. Just doesn't make
Right.
sense.
That's right. That's right.
Um, Pivoting a business model is highlighted as a significant challenge and a common cause of failure. What strategies do you recommend for overcoming the psychological barriers, such as attachment to the original vision, that often prevent leaders from recognizing the need for an effectively executed pivot? And we've seen that with brand names like
Mhm.
Kmart,
Yep.
Kodak, Blockbuster, Montgomery Ward. There's a
Yep.
whole slew of these companies that no longer exist that were once giant killers, right? Look at
That's right.
Sears. I
That's
mean,
right.
Sears owned retail
Yeah.
and hence no longer. And even IBM, even though they're still a profitable company, when we were younger, everybody knew the CEO of IBM. I don't think that there's anybody in business school that can name the CEO of IBM, right? It's just like an
That's right.
afterthought company.
That's right. That's right. No, look, you're spot on. And when you look at the example of Kmart, right, especially the industry that Kmart led and was really one of the pioneers of, right, is
Yeah.
now dominated by Walmart, Target, and it did not have to be that way. But to your point, Kmart didn't listen to their customers, right? At the end of the day, what they didn't do was listen to their customers. When they started seeing that their sales were changing, right, and downward trending, even the littlest bit, they probably should have asked, what could we be doing better, right? Why are you going to another store? What are the value opportunities that they are providing you that we're not? And, I certainly will tell you, I would not have known how to fix Kmart once it went down, right? Started going down. But there was that moment in time where they probably had enough to see they were slipping a bit. And they had that one opportunity to probably make that change um, before they might have had to do a massive pivot. But they didn't, right? So when we're looking at, those principles, right, that kind of go with this framework of constructive worry and user-centric design thinking, you've got to look at signs that are negative, and you've got to ask questions of why we're there and what we could do better. So to your point around making the pivots and adjustments, though, one of the hardest things I think for most business owners is to either look at the business they wanted to start and the idea isn't working, right? Or it did work
Yep.
briefly, but it's not working now. Or when you look at multi-generational businesses, right? Where, a family started a business, you've got second generation, maybe even third generation operating that business. And, look, market dynamics fundamentally changed something, right? Over that period of time. And there's this real pull, right, in everybody's mind to that original idea that you had or that you have for what the business was supposed to be or what it is. And I tell people it's the same thing as when you go through your home, right? And it's time to clean some things out where you've got too much clutter, you have too many things, right? And it's especially true, right, for people who are parents and they have these great memories of when their children were younger, tied to, toys or clothing or something like that. And look, at the end of the day, you can't save all of those things, right? You can think about what are the most important things that you want to save and preserve. But at the end of the day, that, you've got to, you know, update that you got to update that house, or you got to move out of that house and downsize. And when you make those decisions as an adult looking for one story living or something, you can't afford to bring all those memories with you. And that's kind of what it comes down to in a business. What are the core values, right? Don't focus on whether or not, this business that was a, wood products manufacturer that was founded 100 years ago. Are you a wood products manufacturer, or are you a manufacturer of, you know, uh, assets that somebody can put in their home, right? Or in their office? You've got to ask yourself those questions, I think, to really try to understand the business you need to have today. Is kind of turning some of those theories on your head. Again, back to Kodak or Blockbuster, right? What is the business you're in? And if the business you're in is something it sounds like it's a business under attack, you better change what you think that business is.
I mean, isn't that what they said about the train industry? Those guys were super wealthy who created trains, and they forgot they were in the moving of product business, and they could have been in trucking, they could have been in all
Right.
these other things, one end to end shipping, but they didn't
Yep.
look at. They go, well, we're train men, but you're not
Yeah.
really that. That's just the asset you're using to move something from
Yeah.
one place, just like you did with horse and buggies or whatever.
That's right. Well, and to your point, when you look at transportation of goods and you look at, you know, sea shipping, ports, trains, tractor trailers, and that whole spectrum, right, of that evolution of movement of goods. To your point, tremendous missed opportunity, right? If you were in the train business, you didn't realize what business you were in, and there sure are a lot of pieces to it that are highly profitable today, right? So,
Yeah, and absolutely still needed all
mhm,
the time for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about the businesses that have failed and hear that, I think at one time Kmart was a $37 billion business.
Right.
And you can't cut your way to success, right? Every time you see people start downsizing, that's the death knell. I mean, they're
Oh,
going in the wrong direction totally. And
absolutely.
entrepreneurs know that. But when you start putting
Absolutely.
finance people in these positions, because the board's made up of finance people, they
Yep.
just don't get it. I mean, we have a company outside of Philadelphia called Unisys, and Unisys was once a household name, and now it's at the walking dead of 5 billion a year for the
Yeah.
last 30, 40 years.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, and look, I mean, you look at the automotive industry, right? And with, Vin University, right? And
Yeah.
you look at VinFast, right? And
Yep.
a new breed of car maker, much like Tesla, right? In many ways. We're looking at change that is occurring in the auto industry. We're looking at, change that's occurring in the global security marketplace, right? You're seeing, new leaders like Anduril and Palantir and others as information becomes a key uh, national security asset, right? As
Yeah.
much as, tanks and guns, you're seeing change take place. And, in that industry, I think it's going to be interesting to see what the next couple of decades hold because a lot of people talk about, the evolution that's happening in the auto industry, but there's evolutions that are happening in a lot of our old industrial uh, you know, sectors that I think are moving it towards the information technology world in a way that a lot of traditional businesses are likely to go the way of Kodak and Kmart.
Yeah. And there always will be household brands that end up like digital computers when we were younger,
Yep.
and they were a household name, cease to exist
Yep.
anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think always to me, once the founding entrepreneur leaves, then all of a sudden, the percentage chances that company still existing or succeeding starts going down. And even look at Apple. If
Right.
Apple didn't have so much cash already
Mhm.
and a product that sells, Tim Cook hasn't moved the dial in since the day Steve Jobs died 10 years
That's right.
ago.
That's
It's
right.
exactly the same company, and they wouldn't make it. Um,
Right.
in chapter 4 highlights the benefits of Security Council, but also acknowledges the desire of business owners to maintain control. What specific mechanisms or strategies can be implemented to ensure that external advisors provide valuable insights without infringing on the autonomy of the executive team's decision-making process? And that's what you just described before when you were talking to those two guys.
Well, that's right. And look, they came up with a pretty novel way without needing to make any real structural changes, right, to their legal documents, right, that governed their business. Because they already had, an operating agreement for their LLC that basically vested the powers in the board and also vested the power in the managers of the LLC who had corporate type titles, right, as well. But, you know, to your point, there's the how do you make that happen, right? It's partially legal structures, right? Like the documents that actually we use to provide the true foundation of the business structurally, right? That describe how a board or how decisions will be made either by a board or by management team. And then also there's the operational elements, right, of how you decide to implement what's in those legal documents, because those legal documents may have uh, some room for interpretation, right? And so sometimes you need to have policies or agreements, resolutions, right, that even might follow up and provide a little clarity on how we're going to interpret those legal documents operationally.
And chapter 5 emphasizes the importance of a strong management team.
Right.
How should a business leaders address situations where key management team members' performance declines over time, potentially impacting team dynamics and business outcomes? By the way, this is a big problem in family-owned businesses and especially in Asia, where people don't want to make that change because of the ramifications
Yep.
uh, with their own families.
Yes, yes. So look, I mean, the dynamics of family and businesses are, it brings another level of difficulty and stress, right? To your point on having these open communications. What I try to encourage everyone, whether it's, you uh, organizations that do or don't have those familial dynamics, is that open conversations, right, are really what has strong value. And to your point, culturally, right, there are some parts of the world where those open conversations are difficult. I think the good news is that generationally, right, the folks who are, you know, in their 20s now, moving into their 30s, and will ultimately be strong parts of the management teams over the next, couple of decades. Mm, That is an age cohort, right, that thrives on transparency and openness. So I think to your point, while culturally there are always going to be parts of the world where um, openness and transparency may not be as welcomed or valued, right? Broadly, globally, I think the shift to transparency and openness um, has a lot of value. I think it does as we're going through that journey of having these open and transparent conversations. It doesn't mean they're not tough, right? Especially the first time you have them. And I'll just give you kind of some examples in businesses that I've been in or have advised. A lot of folks will say, well, this person's really not leaning into the business as much as they were, right? I understand they're having some familial issues, or they've got a lot on their hands as far as outside of work, but I just don't feel like they're as connected. We're not getting the value, right? And so, what I encourage people to do is have that conversation, right? And have it from this perspective, which is, I value, right, what we do together, right? I value the the journey that we've been on. I feel like some things have changed. I'd love to find out from you your perspective, and I'd love to find out from you what you see the future looking like. Because, sometimes the person who may not be delivering as they were, they may be as afraid to have that conversation around the fact that they aren't interested in managing anymore, right? They'd like to go back to doing rather than guiding and doing, right? And so, what I tell folks is, hard conversations are often the ones that are most important to have, and especially when it comes to the dynamics of the team. Another management type conversation that I often find is, to your point around revenue and sales, revenue and sales, right? They're the engine, right? And sometimes you end up with organizations that truly understand that and create so much incentive for sales that you almost end up with this, let's call it sales support infrastructure, that starts to wonder if they're valued because they're doing things to help with sales, but they're not out there actually executing the sale. So, they may not have a compensation opportunity that aligns as much to the company's growth as the sales folks do. And so one of the things I've seen companies do quite successfully to help with, let's say, management team dynamics is have the sales team obviously have the incentives, right, to go bring in the opportunities. But if those sales decisions and those sales activities end up with negative outcomes from a margin standpoint or from a compliance standpoint, there's some true up on that. And the same thing with the compliance and the operational teams. Hey guys, look, the reality is we're not just looking for operational success. We're looking for revenue growth. We're looking for margin growth. And so we're going to create a structure that doesn't just say, hey, we're going to give you a bonus when you run a clean sheet on compliance, but we're not going to incentivize you on the growth, because guess what happens? The sales guys, right, may want to focus on sales.
Mhm.
Compliance people want to focus on compliance, and you're going to have massive disagreements within that team, right? So having those structures to have those conversations around how do we align incentives so that we're all swimming the right direction, as opposed to being incentivized from a narrow lens based upon the part of the organization we work in. It's really important to do that with your teams.
I also think going back to the person who might not be doing the job, at the
Right.
end of the day, because I work with a lot of family businesses, I say you have an obligation to all the people who are paying their mortgages, their car payments, putting their kids through college, their retirement. That's your number one priority is to make
Yep.
sure that those people end up on safe ground.
That's
And so
right.
you're
That's
having
right.
that hard conversation, but say, this is what I'm doing on your behalf as well. So we need to find out, is this something you can continue on doing? And if
That's
you
right.
really can't continue on doing it, then we either transition to something else or it's just not feasible for the long term. But I've got to look after all the stakeholders involved.
That's
Uh,
exactly right. That's
yeah.
exactly right.
Uh,
So,
and always operating people are thinking about that. You mentioned that the importance of making adjustments and pivots based on market signals. How
mhm.
can business leaders balance the pressure to deliver short-term results with the needs to maintain a long-term strategic vision when considering significant changes to their business strategy? And that's a big problem with public companies.
Oh, absolutely. And look, I think you actually brought, I think, the key distinction I would make, which is privately held companies, right, have in some ways the luxury of being able to balance, right, the short term and the long term in a way that is not on full display for the world, right? Not on full display for Wall Street and all the other investors. Publicly traded companies, right? They are, obviously they need that long-term trajectory to look right, but it is a problem, right? Where, those quarterly results that get reported, th they're graded and often the entire, management and executive team compensation is aligned to those short-term outcomes, right? So it's very difficult. And I think to the point you made earlier around some of the short-sighted decisions that people can make, whether it's a train business or whether it's a camera business, um, they're making those sometimes because of those short-term views that are frankly what help support their wallet. And it may make it so it's harder to make those long-term decisions for the folks who believe they have long-term structural problems, right? And I think you're seeing a lot of publicly traded companies that believe they have long-term problems do that, where you come out and you say, look, uh, we're in an industry that's undergoing a lot of change, right? We are going to see the next several quarters or maybe next year be a down year. So we're just going to give you that guidance, right? And be aware that we are making changes for the long-term growth, right? We're adjusting this. We understand that's going to suppress the stock price. That's going to obviously suppress our opportunities with the business, but we're doing it for those of you who intend to stay as holders of this business for the long term. We're doing it to create a better long-term trajectory. So again, it comes back to that openness and transparency, right? Which is, I think, critically important, especially with the spotlight that's on you as a publicly traded company.
Well, and this is the hour has gone so fast. We could spend the hours talk about this stuff. But you take a look at Google right now,
Yep.
and there we might be talking in the next 5 years. Why did Google fail? Because
Hmm.
if you think about it, why do you need the search engine when you're using ChatGPT or in their case
Right.
Gemini? And so you don't need to
That's right.
see any of the ads.
That's right.
They really need to rethink about how that business is going to work, where they can
Yep.
still generate the ads. Because I think within 2 years, nobody's advertising on that platform unless there's some way to connect AI into it. I know that AI comes up in helping you get information, but it doesn't utilize the advertisers. And I don't see how they're going to make money because more and more people who are using AI are using it full time to
Yep.
do all the research. They're not even thinking of typing into Google to look
That's
up
right.
things, right?
That's
So
exactly right. That's exactly
yeah.
right. Yeah.
And
No,
then you can see people who don't want to make that change like Kodak did because saying, look, we're making all this cash. We've got like $300 billion in cash.
yep, that's right. That's right. Well, and to your point, look, with Google, those of us who, witnessed Lycos and Alta Vista and the fact that you had to use,
Yes.
all these search engines to try to come up with the data you needed, and then all of a sudden Google solved that problem. It was amazing. And I've talked to a lot of folks who use a variety of AI tools, but certainly recognize that um, the AI answer that's generated by one is not necessarily right. The AI answers that are generated by three may end up with a blend that you can use as a human to figure out what's better. But, the speed at which that is going to mean the traditional Google search is over, and the speed at which that means management consulting businesses are going to be fundamentally changed, right? Because we used to go to these management consulting businesses to provide us with information that now you can go get in 5 minutes or less by composing the right
McKinsey's
queries.
McKinsey's already seen this. I have a student work for McKinsey, and they let him go along with a bunch of others. And
Yeah.
now what McKinsey is seeing is that they only care to talk to your expert. So they can generate all the information, hand it to the expert,
Yep.
and basically say to him, interpret for me based on your 30,
Right.
40 years of experience, what are we
Right.
really looking at here and how do we plan it? That's
Right.
an enormous, enormous fundamental change for
Yep.
McKinsey, who was using armies of people right out of college to do all the research, and now it can be done in 5 minutes by even a virtual assistant in the Philippines doing it for you for $10
Right.
an hour.
That's right. Well, and look, to your point at the beginning, which is those who have operated businesses, right? And I assume that most of the folks who joined us today and the folks who listen to
Y-
your podcasts are operators, right?
Yes.
Operators are going to have amazing value in the world of management consulting in a way that today, to your point, right? We think of folks who've been in the consulting industry for decades, and all they've been are consultants, and you've come of age, right? You've graduated from business school, you've gone in and you've consulted, but you've never operated. That operational expertise is exactly what you said that folks are looking for, because all of that grinding of that data that we used to need teams for, that's over, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, I want to tell you, I so enjoyed the book, so enjoyed interviewing a fellow WVU graduate. And let's hope the Mountaineers next year that we're talking about long runs in the NCAA tournament and getting to the national championship game in football. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Everyone have a wonderful weekend.